All right, welcome back, members of the jury. When we last left off, state we were at your case in chief. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Your Honor, this time the state called Stephen Bryant.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this trial will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
Yes, sir, I do.
You need to approach the mic, make sure everybody can hear you. All right, it does move at the base. If you could introduce yourself to the jury and spell your name for the court reporter, please.
My name is Stephen Bryant, Stephen Bryant.
All right, state.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Bryant, would you please introduce yourself to the jury and tell them what you do for a living?
Yes, as stated, my name is Stephen Bryant. I work for the Texas Department of Criminal Justice out of the Correctional Institutions Division, and I'm a director too for the state that covers the Huntsville area for Region 1, and that covers 13 facilities to include the Pulaski unit where death row is housed, as well as G3 offenders.
And you said that you're the director too. What does that mean?
Basically, I'm a regional director for the state, and I have oversight of the security practices and classification statuses of offenders assigned under our custody.
And can you tell the jury too a little bit, how long have you been with TDCJ?
October will be 28 years.
Okay. And TDCJ is Texas Department of Criminal Justice?
Correct.
And then Institutional Division, is that correct?
The Correctional Institutions Division.
And so you said you're coming up on 28 years. What positions have you held there within your 28 years?
I started as a correctional officer in 1993, went to the rank of sergeant, lieutenant, captain, major, assistant warden, senior warden, and now director too.
Have you spent time as a lieutenant or a captain or a guard on death row?
From the years of 2002 to 2010, I served as a lieutenant and a captain assigned to the death row unit.
And where is death row located?
It's at the Pulaski unit in Livingston, Texas.
Can you tell the jury about the restrictive housing on death row?
The,
Judge, I'm going to object to this testimony. It's presuming something that is certainly not in evidence and indicates that to the jury, it invades the province of the jury.
You know, Judge, it's the state's position that we are attempting to elicit testimony so the jury can hear about death row and also about general population if the individual is given life without parole. And so this testimony is relevant, and this witness has personal knowledge about both life without parole facilities and death row.
All right, and I'll also conduct an analysis regarding the probative value and the prejudicial effect. Overrule the defense objection and allow the testimony for now.
Okay, so Mr. Bryant, you said that you spent from 2002 to 2010 working on death row?
yes, ma'am.
Okay, in what capacity did you work on death row?
I was a lieutenant there that served as administrative duties as well as a relief for the shift lieutenants, and then as well as the captain assigned over the death row side.
So can you tell the jury about the housing in death row? Are the individuals who are, if an individual, an inmate receives the death penalty, when they are sent to death row, do they have a roommate?
The inmates in a death row setting are single cell. There what we call ADSEG or restrictive housing, meaning that they are escorted anywhere that they go as far as activity, whether that be to the shower, to the recreation area, to a medical appointment, to visitation. It's just a staff-intensive process that includes different security protocols in there, to where they have to be strip searched before they exit the area, as well as hand restraints. And it takes 2 escorting officers to take them anywhere that they go.
And so an individual, if they're on death row, can you tell us about the restrictive housing versus the time that they are in their housing versus the time that they have a recreation? Because they get a recreation period, is that correct,
Yes.
every day?
Yes, ma'am. In the death row setting, they would be in their cells 22 hours of the day. They would be allowed to have a 2-hour recreation session, depending upon what their levels are within that setting. There are 3 different classification levels on death row. 1 is being the best, with 90 days clear of any kind of disciplinary history. A level 2 would be a chronic rule violator, and level 3 would be somebody who showed an assaultive behavior.
Now, are they, if someone is on death row, do they have access to medical, doctors, nurses, medical care?
Yes, ma'am. They just have to be escorted to those appointments.
Do they have access to dental care?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do they have access to mental health care as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Now, are they, if an individual is on death row, do they have access to a commissary? And if you'd explain to the jury what a commissary is.
Yes, they are allowed to go to the commissary. The commissary is much, best description I can give you is like a convenience store. It's going to have a lot of food items and things in there, chips, sodas. It'll also have some other items to allow them to be able to buy a radio or a hot pot or a fan, some tennis shoes, maybe a personal T-shirt, some shorts type stuff that's been pre-approved by the agency.
Okay, and so they have access, so like a convenience store, to what, chips, candy bars, soda, what else? What other types of food items there?
Bread, maybe some sandwich stuff, ramen noodles, things along those lines.
Okay. And then can they receive packages on death row?
Yes, through the mail correspondence, yes, and through legal correspondence as well.
So packages and letters, is that right?
Yes,
Legal, but also non-legal, is that right?
yes.
Now, you talked a little bit about the recreation period. Is it inside and outside recreation?
They're allotted 5 days of, or excuse me, let me back up. 2 of those days throughout the week have to be allotted for outside recreation, and those 2-hour sessions, and then the rest of it would be for inside a day room setting. The day rooms typically are around, and the outside rec yards too, they're around a 20-foot by 30-foot space for them to be able to recreate in.
Okay, and so in terms of recreation, they can play games, is that right?
Yes, they can take like a checkerboard or a chessboard down to the day room with them.
Okay, can they bring books?
Yes.
Okay, and what other items? They have access, or they can purchase a radio, is that right?
Yes, they can purchase a radio on the commissary, but that'll have to remain inside their cell. They could take some water, maybe a candy bar, 1 bag of chips, something that can be consumed in the time of their recreation period.
And would you say it's a very high security unit?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and what is that based on? Why? I mean, it seems like an obvious question, but why is it a high security unit?
The staff it takes to be able to work on death row, it takes more staff to do that element in that restrictive housing setting than it does per se in general population. It doubles it up. Everything that is offered to a death row inmate has to be brought to them by a staff member. They're fed in cell. They're escorted everywhere that they go. Their necessity exchanges are all done in cell at the door, at their cell door. And everybody's escorted to their medical appointments and things along those lines.
And what about visitation? If they're on death row, are they allowed to receive phone calls, make phone calls, and have visits from family and friends?
Yes, ma'am, they are. It's what we call a regular visit. It's through the glass. It's not a contact visit. It's not a face-to-face. It does have some separation partitions inside there from the public to the offender or the inmate.
And when you say it's not face-to-face, what does that mean? Like there's glass, but can you see through it?
Yes, you can see through it. It's just not where you can touch and be able to socialize like we are in the courtroom here today.
Okay. And so, again, is that for security reasons?
Yes, ma'am.
And how do you compare then, if an individual is sentenced to life without parole, the individual, once they're sentenced to life without parole, how is that person classified when they arrive at TDCJ or prison?
Once we receive them within TDCJ, we will classify them as a G3 offenders. We have 3 or 5 different custody levels in general population. A number 1, a G1 would be equivalent to an outside trustee. A G2 would be somebody that has less than a 50-year sentence but hasn't had any kind of disciplinary history, which would be for anybody coming in with that type of a sentence would come into our agency as the G2. A G3 is the life without paroles or somebody doing a sentence longer than 50 years. And a G4 is based upon their disciplinary history within TDCJ. They would be considered a chronic rule violator. A G5 would be somebody that would have an assaultive history or in sense of maybe being into some contraband issues being found in their possession.
And when you say so, it's so there's 3 classifications upon arrival. Is that a fair statement? It would be 2 upon arrival. G2 status and a G3 status upon arrival. Okay. And then if a person receives life without parole, then they stay at a G3 status.
They would never get higher than a G3 status. Yes.
Okay. And higher meaning, and just so we understand, it's G1 through 5, but 1 is the by saying they can't get higher, they can go to G5. They just
Yes, they can go to G5, but G1 would be the best, simply because of the outside trustee privileges that are there.
okay. And so, how is an individual who you said life without parole? They come in classified as a G3 status. What does G3 status mean at TDCJ?
Well, it's based on their sentence, and they will never be to improve beyond that. Their job statuses within our agency, they're not going to have a job that's going to have full access to the facility. They can work in food service in certain areas that way, but they are not going to be assigned to somebody that just can have multiple accesses to areas within our institutions.
So let me stop you for a second. So if life without parole comes in at G3 status, does a G3 inmates, is that what they're called, G3 inmates, do they have free access? Are they able to walk around the prison? Are they what's considered general population?
Yes, ma'am, they are. A G1 through a G4 custody inmates would have some accesses where they are allowed to walk freely from their cell to the day rooms, from there to the dining hall. They would go to the area that necessities are being issued out to retrieve those, walk straight to the outside recreation areas. So it's not as staff intensive as it would be in a restrictive housing or an ASEG environment.
And G3 housing or G3 status is not considered restrictive housing, is it?
No, it's not.
Okay. And so you said they would have they'd be free to walk around. What does that mean? They're free to go out to the rec yard. They're free to go to the day room, free to go to the cafeteria or the dining hall. They're free to go to medical.
Once the cell doors open for them to go to an activity, the staff member doesn't have to follow directly behind them to be able to go to the activity. They're given the leniency to go walk to that behavior on their own. And again, to go back to the restrictive housing ASEG or death row setting, when the inmate leaves from there, when the doors open, they're going to be in restraints and being escorted by 2 staff members.
So back to the G3 status. What does that mean if they are in G3 status means general population?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and what does that mean, general population, to those of us that are not familiar with the prison system?
The general population is basically consists of most of our population within TDCJ. Roughly, we may have less than 4,000 that are in restrictive housing or in ADSEG. So the rest of the 115,000 that we may have incarcerated would fall under the general population status. And all of those general population inmates are assigned to jobs. Of course, it'll be, if they have medical restrictions, their jobs will fall off into those restrictions that they may have. But we use those offenders to work inside our institutions. Also, it allows for them to be able to go to school, get their educations, and things along those lines.
So a life without parole inmate on a capital murder case, they would have access to have a job, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and they would be able to freely go to their job and interact with other inmates.
That's correct.
Okay. They're able to go to medical on their own.
That's correct.
They're able to go out to the rec yard, is that right, and be in the rec yard?
Yes, ma'am.
And how long is the rec yard open?
The day rooms and the rec yards in general population are open from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And the outside recreation areas, of course, would be restricted to 2-hour increments, but they would be open during that part of the time, or during that time of day from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. And the day rooms are based upon capacity, but they are open from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m.
And so a life without parole individual, they have, obviously they can go to the commissary as well, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And purchase the same items you described?
Yes, ma'am. They're allowed to do a $90 spend every 14 days.
And then can family order items and have it delivered to them as well?
Yes, ma'am.
Are they able, now this day room that you're referring to in the rec room, are they there with other inmates?
In the general population setting, they are.
And that's what we're just talking about. We're
Yes.
talking about, we've discussed death row at first, and now we've moved on to the life without parole general population setting.
In the general population setting, they're out to intermingle with all the other population inmates.
And when we talk about other inmates or in the general population, are those inmates that could be in prison for nonviolent offenses?
Yes.
Okay. And for example, like a drug case,
Yes.
a DWI third,
Yes.
a fraudulent use of identifying information.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, any type of fraud or cases that don't involve victims.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and they're able to just interact with them, and are they able to room with them?
Yes. The inmates in general population will have a cell partner unless they are a trustee. Sometimes the trustees, most of them are in a dorm setting, but the rest of the cells are double occupancy cells.
So if an individual is sentenced to life without parole on a capital murder, does that mean that they will receive, that their cellmate will be someone who has a violent offense like a capital murder, like a murder conviction?
We do try to house our G3s together so that their length of sentences are somewhat similar. We also do compatibilities with height and weight and things along that line too, and age.
Right, but it's based on the number of years and not on the offense.
That's correct.
Okay, so a person who received, say, a 50-year sentence on a drug case and has no violent history could be a cellmate or a room cellmate with an individual who's convicted of capital murder and sentenced to life without parole.
That's correct.
Do they have access, and again, we're just talking about general population, the life without parole inmates. You said they have access to indoor and outdoor rec room. Do they have access to a workout room?
Yes, there's isometric weights on the outside recreation area, also basketball courts and things outside for them to be able to participate in.
And how about volleyball?
Yes, volleyball too.
Softball?
Some facilities may have softball, but most of the ones with the G3s may not have that.
And now the G3, the life without parole, so G3 means life without parole, or inmates who have received a 50-year sentence or above. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. So do they have access, these G3 inmates, are they able to commingle and communicate and spend time, whether it's their job, the rec room, indoor, outdoor, the dining hall, with inmates that are, say, G1, G2 status?
Yes.
Okay, and how is that?
Whether
And why is that?
Some activities such as education and things along those lines, the classroom settings that was going to have mixed custodies in there, the dining hall may have mixed custodies in there, the jobs inside a kitchen, for example, or a laundry may have G1, G2s, and G3s in that area.
And again, G1 is someone who has a trustee status?
Yes.
Okay, and that they're able to, in fact, go outside the prison walls in order to work?
Yes.
Okay, and G2 is someone who's received less than a 50-year sentence.
Yes.
So it could be someone who's received as little as 2 years in prison?
Yes, ma'am.
Or up to, 49 years, but anywhere in the range, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and also for nonviolent offenses.
Correct.
Can you tell us about the telephone availability? What are the inmates that are on G3 status, life without parole, what do they have access to in terms of the use of calling or receiving phone calls?
They won't be allowed to receive phone calls unless it's an emergency process, but them making phone calls, they have access to phones inside the day rooms to be able to call people through our offender telephone system. That can, as long as the family has signed up for that, then they're able to make those calls just any time that they are in the day room.
Now, is a G3, a life without parole inmate, are they ever able to have, you talked about some of the jobs they could have, you said laundry, right?
Yes.
Food service?
Yes.
Okay. Are they able to have a gardening job?
We do have outside work squads that we escort outside the fence to work to do different crops and things along those lines. We refer to that as our field force. And in that regard, they're under armed supervision when they're out there under that classification status.
But they're able to, even though they're under armed, they're able to get outside the gates, is that right?
That's correct.
Are they able to, G3, life without parole inmates, are they able to be with other nonviolent offenders, G1 and G2, at church services?
Yes, they are.
Okay, and what church services are available to them?
Well, we're required to have a non-Protestant, Protestant and Catholic service, and then there's other volunteer groups that come out and host other religious services. The length of the services are dependent upon whether or not there's somebody there to help facilitate the service. If there is somebody there, it's a 2-hour service. If there's not, it's an hour service.
Okay, and so they're all mixed together, right? All the inmates are mixed together, the services, meaning
Yeah.
violent, non-violent, 2-year sentences to life without parole, is that
Yes,
right?
yes, ma'am.
And are these individuals, are they freely again walking around prison? These are general population without handcuffs, without leg restraints, walking to and from their cell to church, dining hall, etc.
Yes, they are allowed to walk to those areas without having to be escorted.
And they're able to walk together in groups, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
What about visitation for inmates that are receive life without parole? When are those visitations occur, and how much time do they receive, and what is the explain to kind of the difference? Like you just talked about death row visitation. How does life without parole? How is that visitation done?
We call it. They are eligible for some contact visitation with certain immediate family members. It's a 2-hour session. Saturday and Sunday is what our policy allows, but due to COVID currently, we have some different protocols in place. But those sessions are 2-hour sessions. And for those that aren't immediate family, they may have a regular visit through the glass where they can see each other and talk to each other on a telephone type system.
Okay, so if an immediate family member comes to prison to visit their family member who's sentenced to life without parole, you said it's a contact visit, what does that mean?
It means that there's a table and they're sitting directly across from them at that table. They're able to embrace with a hug, a kiss, and hold hands during that time frame.
So there's nothing that separates them from their family member or any of their visitors?
No.
And that 2 hours can be extended, is that correct?
It can be approved depending on travel restrictions and things along those lines.
Now, are in these general population settings where life without parole or G3 inmates are sent, are the guards both male and female?
Yes.
And do the guards have, do they carry weapons?
No, they do not.
And the purpose of that is why? Why don't they carry weapons?
It's a safety issue inside of a facility. They are equipped with some chemical agents that they carry to help them with their duties as a self-protecting device in order to protect the needs of others.
In TDCJ, does contraband get inside the walls of prisons?
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay. And I'm talking about the life without parole, facilities where inmates are sent who have received life without parole.
Yes, ma'am. All of our facilities are impacted with the contraband.
Okay, and when you say contraband, what types of items have been found inside TDCJ?
Cell phones, drugs, of course, and then some homemade fashion weapons that may be from inside, but those are the three common ones.
Okay, you said cell phones, and how would a cell phone get into TDCJ or prison?
It could be, unfortunately, from a staff member, but it's also been through the visitation side. We've also had cases where they've actually tried to mail them in through the mail, where we've had to interdict with getting it through the mail process.
And are y'all always successful in your interdictions?
Not always. It wouldn't be in there if it wasn't, but we do make huge strides at it.
Okay. And you said drugs. What type of drugs are found inside the walls of TDCJ?
Marijuana, cocaine, heroin, synthetic drugs, synthetic marijuana, things along those lines.
Again, drugs that are either given through the visitation, during visitation, or mailed in?
It can be through the visitation side, it could be through the mailroom side, it could also be through staff.
Okay. And you mentioned as well that items can be made, that sometimes inmates make weapons. Can you describe what those are and how they're used?
With the construction of our facilities, some of those allows for them to be able to do things. A common thing that's found a lot is some broken chain link fence pieces or something that may be sharpened to a point to make a weapon that we've referred to inside the wall sometimes as a shank. But those are common weapons that we may find inside of a facility, a knife type or a puncture type weapon.
And how can someone make one? You said from the facility, like using what in a facility?
Well, there's a lot of areas within our facilities that are chain link for fencing material. There's other things that are in there. The bed or the bunk inside of a cell is made of metal. There's ways for them to cut some of that to make different things to where it fashions into a weapon.
And then what, in your 28 years or almost 28 years experience with TDCJ, those shanks or those weapons that you've described that inmates are able to make, whether using from a metal portion of the bed or the chain link fence or something, what are those, how have those been used inside TDCJ?
Well, it's sometimes it's used inmate on inmate, and then other times it's unfortunate that the staff are assaulted as well.
Are there, you said sometimes it's unfortunate the staff gets assaulted?
Correct.
Okay. And I guess, is there always the potential threat of a staff member or another inmate being assaulted?
Yes, there is. That is accurate. We have to have our staff prepared to deal with any of those types of scenarios, and with that, they have to be on their guard, and for that potential element to be there. In dealing with the inmate populations that we have, sometimes that act of aggression, you never know when that's going to happen or occur.
What about, what's called chunking?
Chunking is referred to where somebody has had either feces, urine, or water thrown on somebody out of a container device to strike the staff or other inmates, as far as that goes, with that substance.
And is that another type of assaultive behavior that occurs within TDCJ?
Yes.
Either inmates on other inmates or inmates on a guard?
Yes.
Now, are inmates allowed to have sexual intercourse in TDCJ?
No.
Okay. Consensual or non-consensual?
TDCJ does not consider consensual sex inside of prison.
Okay. Does it happen? You said they don't consider it, but can you elaborate on that?
Well, due to them being in custody, the consensual sex is not an accepted behavior.
But does that occur? Consensual or non-consensual sex, does that occur within TDCJ?
I'm sure there's instances of it, yes.
Now back to, we were telling the jury the different places that the freedom that general population inmates have, including inmates who receive life without parole. How would you describe that freedom? They can go to the library, is that right?
Yes, library services, all library services are offered to those offenders. Again, it's just they're able to sit there and walk themselves to those areas. Of course, it may be under a lay-in type status, but they can still walk themselves into those areas without having to have a staff member there to take them directly to that activity.
And you said they're able to walk. Are they in a hallway by themselves when they're walking?
Typically not. That traffic is usually controlled to where if they're coming out of an area to go there, there's other inmates that are also going to those activities with them as well.
Okay. And so at any one time, for example, in a law library, church service, the dining hall, the rec center, inside or outside, how many inmates are they around at any one time?
That changes from facility to facility, but there could be 100 inmates inside of a dining hall. There could be over 100 inmates inside of a church service. Could be 30 inmates inside of a classroom. Same with law library, or even going to the general library.
Okay. And none of these inmates are handcuffed?
That's correct.
And none of these inmates are restrained in any way. Is that right? No leg irons, no handcuffs?
No restraints are on them for that activity in general population.
Okay. And are restraints put on at all in the general population?
The staff do carry some hand restraints, and if they find somebody that's acting out, being aggressive, they go through some protocols of placing those into restraints to remove them from that environment.
So that's only if they have already done something in order for them, after the fact, to put on the handcuffs. Is that a fair statement?
That's correct.
Okay. So they're doing it as a reaction to what the inmate has already done.
Yes.
Okay. And finally, is there the mission statement of TDCJ? Is the word punishment anywhere in the mission statement?
No, ma'am.
Okay. Can you tell us about that?
About our mission statement?
Right. These inmates are not punished. Is that a fair statement?
Their punishment is set
Judge,
by.
I'm object to the leading questions and our testimony.
Stand.
So, the mission statement of TDCJ is not to punish inmates, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. And you talked about assaultive offenses or assaultive behavior. What are you referring to? What does that mean?
That could be an assault against a staff member of any kind and or an inmate, whether that be through physical fight, through assault with weapons that we discussed earlier. Could be group assaults that may occur. But that's assaultive behavior, or to include the what you mentioned about chunking a while ago with the water, or the feces or urine, and being thrown on our staff or other inmates. Those would all be considered assaults.
And what about threats?
Threats are taken as an assaultive behavior as well.
And do all those things you just mentioned, also including sexual assaults, right?
Correct.
Okay. And do all the things that you just mentioned, from threats to sexual assaults to assaults on physical assaults on, say, guards or other inmates, chunking, do all those occur within the walls of TDCJ?
Yes.
And what is the ratio in general population, an inmate who's in a facility where there are other, obviously G1, G2, the lesser, the inmates who've received lesser sentences when they're mixed with them in the population? What is the ratio of inmates to guards?
That is solely dependent upon the facility that they're at. In general population, where G3 offenders are typically housed, there may be one officer to 144 offenders inside of one housing area. And then on the death row side, there may be 2 officers assigned to 84 offenders that are in one housing area.
So one officer to 144 inmates in general population?
Yes.
And you said on the death row it's 2 officers to 84 inmates?
Correct.
And these 144 inmates are freely walking around. They're not restrained. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I'll pass the witness.
Is the back director?
Yes, sir. That's fine.
Okay, so Director Bryant. All right. Does the Texas Department of Corrections have any kind of diagnostic? That is, when an inmate first goes, that he goes through some series of testing or anything like that?
When an inmate first arrives within TDCJ, there is what we call an intake process, where they go through a sociology review. They'll also be seen by medical and mental health and go through those review processes.
Okay. And at what point is an inmate given this classification?
After all of that, what we just talked about with the sociology, the medical, and the mental health processes are there, they will be seen by classification committee members immediately following that process.
Okay. So an inmate who is sentenced to life without parole can come into TDC and be classified D5, correct?
We would not automatically classify them as a G5 offender, not in the intake process. They would all either be a G2, or if they were a life without parole or a 50-year sentence or higher, they would be classified as a G3.
As a D3. Well, I thought you said earlier, depending on what was in their background when they showed up.
I never said anything about their background when they showed up.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, now you talked about these jobs that they had. And I think you said, though, that if you were D3, you were limited in some of the jobs you could have.
Yes.
And so, what can't they do?
They're not supposed to be in a job as, say, a janitor. They have access to multiple areas to be able to clean and do whatnot, do those types of things. If they're assigned into a kitchen area, they would be into an area that was to be able to be secured. And the same way would be in the laundry and things along those lines.
Okay. You'd mentioned contraband. The jail can search an inmate's cell at any time, right? I'm sorry, the prison guards, they can search a cell at any time, correct?
That's correct.
They don't have to go to a judge and get a search warrant.
No, sir, we do not.
They just say, okay, we're shaking down the cell, we're doing it right now.
Yes, sir.
And that can happen anytime, any day.
Yes, sir.
All right. And when you're talking about they go to the rec room, the commissary, the guards are there in those rooms, correct?
There is a correctional officer supervising that activity. Yes, sir.
Okay, so, well, for example, when you say there's one guard to 144 inmates, you're talking about the number of guards as opposed to the entire population of the prison.
That 144 would be one particular housing area, and there would be one officer assigned to that area, and inside that area there's also day rooms and things that day room is in there, that they're intermingling with the inmate population with that one staff member for 144 inmates.
But when the inmates are locked up, there's still the same number of guards.
Correct.
Okay. And so this idea that these inmates are just walking around freely, an inmate can't decide just to take a straight line across a field if he wants to, can he?
No, he cannot.
Okay. There are lines he's literally got to walk along.
Correct.
And they are painted on the concrete of the prison, correct?
Correct.
And he can't walk on the left side of it, he's got to walk on his side of it and maintain that route at all times.
Correct.
Okay, so they're not roaming around.
They're not roaming around, but they're able to walk without staff having to have hands on them to escort them to an activity.
Right. But if they get caught crossing that line, they'll be disciplined.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, sir. I have no other questions.
I just have one. Whether or not they're walking on a line to get to the location, but when they get to their location, they could be in a room with 100 or so inmates, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
With one guard?
Yes, ma'am.
With the guard who has no weapons?
Correct.
And he asked you about walking in a field. I mean, are there fields out there? Or, I mean, what was that in reference to when he said, no, he can't just walk in a field or walk across a field?
The way that I was taking the counselor's question was that he was trying to say if he wanted to walk across this area to go directly over there, he couldn't take that path. He would have to sit there and follow the lines along the walkway to get to that area. There are some rules that are in place for that general population area. It's just that they're able to walk on their own. It's just not where they can have to be directed by the staff member and being held by them to take them to that activity.
So they are able to, I mean, sure they're having to walk along, say, a line area, but they're able to walk with other inmates and be with other inmates. And they're if they step off the line or do something like that, there's that one guard to correct them?
There may be a staff member down the walkway that would be given direction for them to get on the other side of the line.
And are there, besides inmates and guards inside the prison, are there also civilian volunteers that are able to come inside a prison?
Yes, there are. There are. We have civilian employees. We have employees that aren't having to wear a uniform that work inside our institutions, and there are also a lot of volunteer bases that come in to help facilitate church services and things along that line.
And what are the other? You said they have them to facilitate church services. What other volunteers come into prison, the inside of a prison?
Mainly our volunteer base is typically solely around church activities. There's civilian employees or non-uniform employees that we have that work for us that work in various different capacities. Some of our industry supervisors, part of the jobs that we have that are out there don't require somebody to wear a uniform for those duties.
So, for example, someone who can work inside a prison who answers the phone?
Correct.
Or who does what? What other type of civilian jobs that are inside the prison walls who the inmates have access to?
Our teachers, our medical personnel,
Doctors,
nurses. We may have Our commissary employees would not be wearing a uniform.
And they're not guards, right? Well, not wearing a uniform means they're not law enforcement, they're not guards?
Yes, ma'am. They're not a correctional officer.
Okay.
And then there's other clerical duties that we have that are throughout the facility doing various different aspects of the job. And then what we call a counsel substitute for somebody that is investigating disciplinary infractions and helping the inmate get their due process rights heard and together for their hearings.
And so all those civilian individuals who come inside a prison, doctors, nurses, teachers, volunteers for the church services, clerical staff, are they walking around, going to and from, say, where they enter the prison to the various locations along with the inmates?
Many of them do have access throughout the whole facility.
The civilians?
Yes.
And do the inmates have access to the civilians?
Yes.
I'll pass it.
In the prison structure, are there like surveillance cameras and video?
Some of our facilities do have that, and then some do not.
Okay. And TDC decides what institution an inmate is going to go to, correct?
Yes, to an extent. There's some, and for somebody assigned to death row, they're only going to be assigned to the Polunsky unit.
But someone with life without parole.
Yes, we would decide what unit they get assigned to.
And every unit in TDC is a maximum security unit, isn't it?
And that's not correct.
Okay. Well, would someone serving life without parole be put in anything other than a maximum security unit?
They would only be at a maximum security facility.
I have no other questions, thank you.
But in this maximum security facility are individuals who could have received a 2-year prison sentence for a non-violent offense?
Yes, they could be inside those facilities as well.
Or someone who's convicted of DWI third, is that right?
Yes,
Or a drug offense?
yes.
And they are walking, eating,
You know,
sleeping?
this is just repetitive.
Well, I'm just
and
trying to
not in rebuttal to the question I asked.
I'll sustain the repetitive nature of the question.
I'll pass the witness.
You're not straight.
All right, you're excused.
Yes, sir, thank you.
On approach.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
A life of their own. There's some coordination that needs to be done, and then we'll be able to take up this trial back again. Not till Monday, 9 o'clock in the morning. So I'm going to re-urge the instructions I've given you. Don't look up any information anywhere, online, on TV, in print. Don't do any kind of an independent investigation as driving to scenes or looking for locations. Don't look at the law. Don't discuss this evidence with anybody. The first time you'll be able to talk about the evidence in this case is after I read you the punishment charge, and then you begin the deliberations on punishment. Until then, have a good weekend. We'll see you Monday morning, 9 o'clock in the morning.
All right, for the jury?
We have a docket set for the morning.
Oh. Okay. Well, maybe I'll call it.